CodeRed rules, and welcome to my second Grind School short video. Today I'm going to go over when you should be folding trips, and trips specifically. I'm not talking about sets here, and if you guys don't know the difference, a set is when you hold a pocket pair, and then you flop, or turn, or river a card that then gives you three of a kind with a pocket pair. In this instance, I'm talking about trips, where you have two you have one non-paired holding, right, and you end up flopping three of a kind on the flop here. And here's an example. I totally made this up. This is not happening, even though the players on this table are real. And I basically just took this hand from yesterday's Grind School Cash series and messed with it what I wanted to do. Alright, so let's say, okay, we're Pyrotos here. He raises up 3x in the small blind. We get called from the big blind. And we end up flopping trips, okay? And I'm going to show you a good example where it's really easy to just go ahead and fold. We go and bet the flop, we bet the turn, alright? We end up betting the river, and then our opponent decides to go all in the situation, okay? Completely made up situation. Would we be wanting to fold here or to call? Well, obviously, I think this is a fairly clear fold to a lot of you guys. You know, our opponent could easily have a higher kicker with the 8, or he could very easily have the flush out here. So we don't have the nuts. And that's kind of what I'm going to end here. When you don't have the absolute nuts, it's a lot easier to fold. And it's also, how likely is your opponent to have the nuts over your current hand? So it's probably likely that our opponent doesn't have a higher 8, because he probably would have raised the flop on us if that was the case. Alright, so he's either going to have a hand like pocket queens, pocket twos, probably not pocket aces. Maybe he could be in slow playing the entire time. But the hand range that I would end up calling off here would be only a flush, and that would probably be it if we don't have a boat. So it would be a flush or a boat. So even if we had king 8 here, I feel like we would still have to be holding, because I feel like our opponent has a flush or a boat so very often. And I'm trying to think, even if we had like a really weak flush here, we probably would still be wanting to fold quite often. So what if we were to change this board around quite a little bit, right? So what if we were to make 2 of spades, a 2 of clubs, okay? So the flush wasn't out there. Well, when our opponent jams the river, then you can't really have the flush, so his range becomes really a higher 8, a better 8 or boat of some kind. And when that happens, then it's really going to be kicker related. So let's say we did have king 8 in that instance. We probably would call off king 8, but have a real hard time calling off anything lower than king 8. We would be folding probably 8-6 there as well, as long as our opponent doesn't have the flush. It's because our opponent is representing a hand that is either trip 8s or better, and he probably doesn't have very many bluffs in his hand range, because not many people are going to be bluffing all in the river with their stack, right? So not saying he won't have a bluff, but you got to give him some credibility in that instance, and I would be folding the 8-6 as well there. Now, we can go ahead and change this hand around even a little bit more, and let's say we are the ones who called the 8-6. So let's say these situations are reserved, and Dakabear was the one betting on all 3 streets, and Pyrotos was the one calling. Right? So what would happen there? We wouldn't want to put ourselves in a situation where we would have to fold a hand like 8-6. All right, and what that means is, don't make raises that overrep our hand. So let's say we end up calling the flop and then raise the turn. Well, that doesn't become very smart, because then when we have a hand like the trip 8s, right, and we raise when the flush hits on the turn, we're actually representing the flush and not the trip 8s. The reason why that's a problem is then when our opponent goes over the top of us, we're going to be having to fold, because our opponent is representing an even stronger hand than we have. Now we could arguably raise the flop with the 8s when we have the 8-6 here, and that is just because we're representing. We could easily have a bluff. We have the 8, which is by that point a really strong hand. Our opponent's going to be calling us a lot wider on the flop, including like any queen, any flush draw, overcards, and possibly even some like combo draws of some kind. So raising the flop becomes more standard, but when we start getting later in the street, when we start to raise, those raises have a lot more meaning to them and become a lot stronger. And so the goal is to maybe, when we do raise, make our hand look not as strong, and therefore we don't have to fold the trips nearly as often. Back on the kicker thing again, let's say like we end up flopping 8-8, ace deuce, right? And we have a hand like ace 3, right? And that's a good example where, alright, we have a really strong hand on a dry board, but who's going to be calling us in that instance other than a pair between twos and aces, and then another ace? And if another ace calls us, we're always behind. So the goal within that one is to not build a big pot, while also getting value. So like a little bit of deception there helps on the ace deuce board when we have the ace 3. If somebody else keeps betting, then we need to be mindful of what opponent will be betting with. I would probably not raise at all in that scenario. And arguably, if you never raise in a situation like that, then we really shouldn't have to fold. Now, if it was like a 3-bet pot, alright, and you have trips, chances are you really shouldn't be folding. Okay, just because the pot's so big, and that's compared to the stack size. And that's something I'm going to bring up where, depending on the pot size and the stack sizes, you just can't fold. So let's take, for example, here, Pyrotos had to bet 72 cents in this river. Our opponent only had a min-raise bet left in him, and he min-raises it up instead. Alright, well, yeah, we can't fold with that, because it's just the pot odds that we're getting, and the stack size is behind. And it's going to be like that everywhere. Even if we flopped like, let's say we have the 10 high flush, and we're 200 big blinds deep, and our opponent goes all in on the river, right? Arguably then, you can make the fold, depending on your opponent. So that's another thing too, where opponent is going to matter. If your opponent is a really loose, aggressive player, and is just kind of going all over the place and is really crazy, then it's going to be really hard for you to fold anything, let alone just a strong hand like trips. However, if your opponent is really, really tight, and he's not going to be putting in his money without really having a really strong hand, then be more willing to fold, but also be careful with the way you play your hand, so maybe you don't have to fold. And that is probably what the number one lesson I'm trying to get to here is how you play the hand is going to determine whether or not you have to fold. Right. So, alright guys, thanks for listening, thanks for watching this Grammar School Short, and if you guys have any comments or questions, go ahead and please post in the forums. Thank you.